Videos like this are made possible by the generous support of patrons like Frosty Moon. Thanks, Frosty. Hello, Penguinauds, I'm the Bitty Penguin, and welcome back to For All Kerbalkind. We've had a little bit of a hiatus, but I haven't been idle during that time. I've been hard at work on the mod pack, and one of the updates to our mods has actually provided us with a whole bunch of new biomes on Earth, which is why you saw a whole bunch of science flooding in from our low Earth orbit satellites and their TV cameras that have miraculously discovered new biomes across planet Earth. We've also managed to grab ourselves the Deep Space Science Experiment node, which includes a new spy satellite technology, which I'm sure we'll be utilizing in future episodes. But on to our first launch of the day. Zooming past a newly reconstructed Plesetsk due to some rule changes I will talk about later, we are launching Progress 2. Yes, we're resupplying our Salyut 4 space station because their food, oxygen, water, and carbon dioxide scrubbing lithium hydroxide canisters are dwindling. These Progress supply vessels carry about 100 days or so worth of supplies for 3 Kerbals. Ilgiz from the Russian SSR, named by my patron Darth Malachor, Hendrik, named by my patron of the same name, and from the German Democratic Republic. Seems we have a lot of Kerbals from Germany. And of course Uncoloso from Mad Science Minutes, who is from Zambia, who is certainly a favourite in the previous episode. Now we're performing multiple resupplies because most of the mass on this Progress vehicle and the previous one has actually been UDMH and NTO to refuel the space station, because if you remember, we used all of its propellant to get it into orbit due to a slightly less than optimal launch. Now is as good a time as any to talk about our rule changes, though. You may have noticed in the intro I had the cheat menu open, and that's because even though we previously capped our research speed at 2.5 science points a day, we've now changed the rules so that we can upgrade that, but each upgrade point we put into R&D costs us 100 science. Now we've done that because one of the requirements for landing a base on the moon is to perform an orbital survey scan, and that's actually quite an advanced technology. It was a decision we made to try and slow us down a little bit, allow Carnasa to catch up, and to push those base landings into the early 1970s, because our moon landings were way ahead of time, and we're trying to put things back into more historical context. And also so that we can do some more interesting things in the meantime, some more interplanetary missions and the like, instead of just racing for a shoestring base, basically a cardboard shelter at the south pole of the moon. And also, we have massive science stockpiles. You may have noticed we had about 4,000 science, which we have invested entirely into our research speed so that we can get those speeds up and hopefully research that tech by 1970. And we're in 1967 now, so that gives us a fair bit of breathing room to do some cool shenanigans in the meantime, instead of, as I said, just sprinting for bases. One of our other changes is more of a time saver than anything. We're limiting ourselves to 1 space center with 3 build queues, instead of having multiple space centers with extra build queues. And that's mainly just to prevent having to go into the tracking stations, switch space centers, etc., and manage Baikonur and Plesetsk, or Brownsville and Wallops in N9's case. And we've done that simply because most of the time in game is unfortunately spent in load screens with this mod pack, and it takes a good 15 minutes to go swap to another space center, sort it out, and swap back again. What we've done instead is we've got our 1 space center, and then we have Kerbal constructs launch pads at the other site, and then we have those launch pads represented by Kerbal construction time launch pads at our main space center. So we can launch from that other launch site, but we don't actually need to swap there. We don't have to move our KSC to that location if we want to launch from it. Everything is controlled from the 1 space center screen, which saves us a lot of time, makes things a little easier to keep track of, and we only have 3 build queues to keep track of now instead of 4, which we can justify as post-moon landing budget cuts. As you see though, Progress 2 has now reached Salyut 4, and we can give it the all-important supplies. They were running on about a day's worth of supplies left, so I'm sure Uncoloso there is a little relieved that he's not going to have to abruptly return to Earth a little bit early. We will be sending up a new crew to Salyut 4, but in another few months, because well, we're in talks with the European Space Agency of perhaps sending one of their Kerbals to the station ahead of their first crewed launch with their own capsule, hopefully at the beginning of 1968. Heading back over to the R&D Center though, we've unlocked 2 new engines that have spontaneously appeared in the tech tree, the KTDU-416 and the RD-510. In fact, these configs already existed in Realism Overhaul, but they weren't assigned to any parts. They're actually quite important Soviet lander engines that filled a very important niche in the tech tree, and so I've added them into the game so that I can use them. Heading on over to a land down under though, the European Space Agency launches Pyramus from Woomera, Australia, the last of their lunar impactor probes, narrowly saving the agency from bankruptcy after a series of failures earlier in the year. It's good to see our European comrades doing well though, as they take big strides towards their first crew capsule launch. Heading on over to affairs from across the Atlantic though, Wanderer 2 from the United States ends up winning the 3-way race to become the first probe to land successfully on the surface of Mars. A partial success though, as upon touchdown, it promptly keels over and the rover is unable to be deployed, which means the door is open for the Soviet Union's Krasny 3 Mars Accord rover to become the first successful rover to land and explore the Martian surface. Of course, Krasny 3, which will be arriving in the next episode, has other mission priorities as well, including returning surface samples from Mars's moons of Phobos and Deimos. But before then, we've got a few more launches. This is us lining up our launch window to send a probe to Saturn. Yes, we have a Saturn launch window, and we're going to take advantage of it. We have our Tsiolkovsky satellite bus, which we sent to Jupiter, but after unlocking new science experiments, I think we are going to send a slightly larger and more capable probe out to Saturn. Tsiolkovsky 2 has to launch on a UR500 compared to the R11D that the Tsiolkovsky 1 probe was able to launch on, because it is a much larger spacecraft. Not only is it going to orbit Saturn, but it's going to visit some of its moons, hopefully ending up in a final orbit around Titan. This is going to net us a lot of science. It's a 2.5-ton spacecraft, only just under a ton lighter than Europa Clipper. It's going to arrive at Saturn in a little over 7 years. There's not really much point sending probes beyond Saturn unless we sent them on a really eccentric hyperbolic orbit, because they simply won't arrive before this series ends. We've pretty much decided that we want to end this series around the 1980 mark with crewed landings on Mars. That's what we're aiming for, so this will definitely arrive a little ways before then, and every bit of science helps, particularly with us now changing the rules such that we require science to upgrade our research speeds. You can see the satellite bus in all of its glory there though, with 9 RTGs and that KTDU-416 engine that we only just unlocked. I had a little look and realized it's really well suited to this mission. We needed the performance of a gas generator engine over a pressure-fed engine to make this mission work. We need 7.5 kilometers per second of delta V to launch directly out to Saturn and get there in a reasonable time frame without gravity assists, which, as I mentioned, with the series aiming to end around 1980, we need to actually take into account. But this KTDU-416 engine is really uniquely suited for this. It's really a smaller and lighter version of the same engine we used to land our early lunar probes on the moon. As such, it's deeply throttleable and it has 11 ignitions. It does, however, come at the cost of having the possibility to fail, and we may well end up regretting this if we get halfway out to Saturn and the engine explodes. Its pressure-fed cousins that we've put on all of our previous interplanetary probes don't have such concerns, but as such their delta V is much more constrained. We want this to visit not just Saturn, but many of its moons and end up orbiting Titan. It even has an instrument to sample the upper atmosphere of Titan if it manages to make it that far. But we're going to be following along this probe in the distant future, because it has a long journey ahead of it out into the void. We have a little innovation on the spacecraft, because once we get out to Saturn, every last watt is going to count. The output of these RTGs is going to degrade during the time it takes to get out there. Plutonium-238 has a half-life of around 40 years after all, and that UHF antenna we used to complete our burn is now just wasting 23 watts of idle power. So after we deploy our magnetometer boom and we get out to a sufficient distance that we're about to be able to use our S-band antenna, we're actually going to decouple the antenna. We don't have any use for it anymore, and we reduce our power requirements by 23 watts, therefore extending the life of the probe once it gets out into the outer solar system. But that's the last we're going to see of Tsiolkovsky 2 for a long while. It has a correction burn in a few years' time, but then after that, as I said, it's going to be a fair few episodes before we ever see this thing again. The little probe that could. But we aren't the only nation taking advantage of the Saturn launch window, as on Freedom Day 1967, the United States launches their own Traveler 4 probe. Although it's a little less ambitious than Tsiolkovsky 2, it's merely a flyby mission rather than an orbiter, and it's a lot more limited in its scientific payload. And we're not just going to one-up them in how cool our probe is, we're also going to one-up them in the number of them that we're launching. Yes, we're launching a second probe to Saturn. It has multiple moons that are worth orbiting and exploring, and with the possibility of its main engine failing, I felt much more comfortable having a second. This is an identical probe, Tsiolkovsky 3. The Saturn launch window is actually pretty massive. Launch windows out to the gas giants are pretty long, just because the spheres of influence of said gas giants are so massive. And so we're going to launch this second probe and have it arrive just slightly after Tsiolkovsky 2. And this one is aiming for Enceladus. And a little bit harder to get to, but we can afford to be a little risky if both probes get out there, as we'll have redundancy. I've sort of taken a bit of a leaf out of real-life NASA's playbook with the Voyager 1 and 2 probes, Pioneer 10 and 11, etc., pairing probes up in case one explodes. It's not a bad methodology to have, and so we're going to launch this out towards Saturn again, using that RD-301 fluorine engine. This is pretty much the largest fluorine stage we could use before requiring a second engine, as we'll be hitting the rated burn time of the engine. But this engine really is becoming a powerhouse, a real workhorse of our deep space exploration. We did briefly lose contact with the probe halfway through the burn, but thankfully we managed to re-establish communications with our orbiting geostationary satellite network. A little bit scary, but considering how long the burn was, we had more than ample time to re-establish contact. And there we have it. Tsiolkovsky 3 has completed its burn towards Saturn, and we have a pair of little probes heading out there to stay. So we'll be smugly waving at Traveler 4 as it screams on past, and we are comfortably orbiting two of Saturn's most interesting moons. Heading on back to the Space Center, you get a first-hand example of what I was talking about earlier, selecting our Plesetsk pad in the Kerbal Constructs window, and then selecting the Kerbal Construction Time pad, so that we can be rolling out vehicles to our various separate pads simultaneously. And now we're going to launch Progress 3. As I said, the previous spacecraft carried predominantly fuel, and now we're going to give them a bunch of supplies to last them until the next Soyuz spacecraft brings up another international crew, including an ESA astronaut. Seeing the beautiful new Earth scatters there, provided by RSS Reborn, which do come with a very significant performance cost, which is one of the key reasons I'm building a new computer at the moment, which I'll finish once my brand new Ryzen 9800X3D processor that I pre-ordered arrives in a couple of weeks' time. It's also going to have 128 gigabytes of RAM compared to my current 32. That should finally sate the endless hunger of this mod pack. Really just the RSS Reborn part of this mod pack that makes the game look so darn beautiful. But Progress 3 reaches orbit without a hitch. We're skipping through most of it as you've already watched one launch of this spacecraft earlier in this episode. The rendezvous with Salyut 4 though doesn't go entirely to plan, but first we have to free up a docking port that Progress 2 is taking up. Now this only barely reached the station because it was a little bit over capacity carrying all that fuel. But now that we've emptied it of all of its resources, it has more than enough Delta V to plunge headfirst into the fiery depths of the atmosphere below. Not that we get much of an exciting fireworks show as this descends. I thought it might at least catch fire, but it just kind of goes poof in a not particularly dramatic fashion. You don't get that many fireworks unless you're on a lunar re-entry, it seems. Heading on back over to Progress 3, I didn't notice that as beautiful and perfect as our rendezvous was, I took way too much time doing it. I was trying to be as efficient as possible as we almost ran out of fuel on the previous Progress spacecraft, and as a result, I ended up running out of electric charge on final approach. And I really mean final approach. I was like 5 minutes away from docking. And as a result, we have to actually dock the space station to the resupply spacecraft. We've also lost attitude control on it, so if we bump it, and it starts spinning, we are never going to be able to rendezvous with it. So we're using the Soyuz to actually bring us in for our close approach. But since we were already lined up with the station, thankfully, things could have been much, much worse than they were. We merely have to translate forward and bring ourselves in for a nice, slow and steady docking, managing to restore the batteries of the Progress spacecraft and unload all of its dearly needed supplies. In fact, fully stocking the space station with consumables for the foreseeable future. And now we're heading back to the Space Center once more as we unlock basic life support and ISRU, as well as dumping a few more points into our research speed. And this is a very important tech. It's one of the requirements for our lunar base. It gives us a vacuum scrubber and nothing else of note, really. I can't think of any other important technologies it might give us access to. I can't imagine us needing any of that stuff later on around Shackleton Crater. I don't know what you're talking about. Before we get to that, though, we've got a lot more of our Phase 2 lunar exploration to complete. And so this is Rodina 9, the second of our N2 launched extended lunar missions. And this one is not merely performing a targeted landing in a specific biome, this is aiming to rendezvous with Lunar Cod 6, which has been diligently collecting surface samples from various different biomes across the near side of the moon. Now, we're not only going to rendezvous with it to collect its surface samples, which is of course a bonus of this mission, but we also have a rover exploration contract. We have to get into the seats and drive to a bunch of sites to survey them. So we've got a pretty great crew to complete this mission. We have Svetlana, who out of the three of them is actually kind of the rookie when it comes to lunar missions. She's never been to the moon before, but she will do now. She's commanding the mission and she is going to be our LEK pilot. But accompanying her down to the surface is Felix Kerman from the Hungarian People's Republic. He is named by start. He was actually our first intercosmos Kerbal, and he's been to the moon before on Rodina 5. If you remember, that was our Apollo 10-esque dress rehearsal mission, which could have been the first mission to land on the surface of the moon, but unfortunately, despite getting there at the same time as Trinity 2, we decided to hold off from going for a landing, and then we were beaten with Trinity 3 by a mere month. How I'm sure it still stings Felix to this day that they didn't go for it on final approach. Not that he would have actually been in the LK, because Stasia was the single occupant. Valery has also been to the moon previously, although he hasn't been in a Soyuz. He went on our Seva mission, making him one of 2 of the first Kerbals to ever orbit the moon. How far things have come since those days, where we had to do an Earth orbit rendezvous to assemble a spacecraft even capable of orbiting the moon. While we're performing our TLI, I thought I'd answer some questions people have been asking as to why we're still using the NK31 kerosene engine for our translunar injection instead of those shiny, sexy new NK15 VM Hydrolox engines. And the answer is simply that we don't need the performance. The NK31 has never failed in flight. It's got more than enough performance to send this entire complex out to the moon. And well, Hydrolox is not only more expensive, but it's much less dense, so we'd need to tool new, larger tanks. We'd need a larger payload fairing, and hydrogen would also boil off in orbit. This lunar complex has the capability to remain in orbit for a couple of days while waiting for an optimum transfer window. So it gives us just ultimately a lot more flexibility, and it allows us to reuse some tanks, reuse some engines, a reliable, restartable engine at that, and not have to retool the entire payload fairing while we're at it. So ultimately, we just didn't need to replace it. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Same goes for the Block Day transfer stage, which is also identical to our previous lunar mission profile. The only thing that needed to change was a more capable lander and a more capable Soyuz carrying 3 cosmonauts to the moon and then 2 cosmonauts down to the surface and keeping them there for multiple days so that we could complete these contracts. These contracts that we're receiving now for lunar exploration, they take multiple days, and the LK simply was not capable of supporting a single Kerbal for that long, even if we had rendezvoused with a lunar cod on the surface. I suppose we could have rendezvoused with a much larger mobile base-esque lunar cod, but that's perhaps something for future extended missions. Now, we actually have 2 of these lunar rover exploration contracts to complete. This is the first one. I don't know if we'll launch another rover. We may have enough time between these missions that LunarCod 6, depending where the contract wants us to visit, may be able to travel to the other destination and be used for a second time, which would be kind of amazing. We did originally launch 2 of these rovers to complete both these missions, but LunarCod 4 has long since run out of electric charge and died at the bottom of a lunar crater, so LunarCod 6 really is the little rover that could. I would still like to rendezvous with LunarCod 4 at some point, but it's on the far side of the moon, which makes it much harder to get to. And as I said, it's out of electric charge, so we can't use it to travel anywhere, but it is carrying surface samples from 5 or 6 different far side biomes, which would be very lucrative for us to collect. So perhaps something for a future mission to consider. But I don't know how many more of these missions we're going to be doing. Perhaps another 3 or 4? After that, though, I imagine we'll be switching over to using the LK700 on the UR700 with a direct descent profile. I'd like to get the hang of that and test it before we're relying on it to ferry cosmonauts to and from a lunar base, but that's something for a future episode. Although those of you that know your space history might notice that the KTDU416 I added into the tech tree is actually one of the key engines on the LK700 direct descent lunar lander. Updates to RO engines added all of the other engines, including the main engines for the UR100, which we were previously missing, so I may well redesign that since we want to launch a whole bunch of new low Earth orbit satellites to gather science with our new science experiments from all these new Earth biomes. But that particular engine was also adapted for the LK700 lunar lander, and we have everything else we need except the vernier engines that we used on Final Approach and for attitude control, and that's what those KTDU416 engines were used for. The RD510 is an interesting one because it actually uses peroxide, which is kerosene and hydrogen peroxide, which is a pretty unique fuel mix. Usually only British engines use that combination, and it uses that for a multitude of reasons, but namely that it's quite a dense combination of propellants, and it actually ends up being well suited for lunar landers, and that was actually test fired and would have been used for landing base modules on the surface. And of course, once I realized that that had a config in Realism Overhaul but no part to go along with it, I simply had to add it in. I think that's exactly what we'll be using to land our Zvezda base modules in future episodes, but that is a long way off yet. For now, the LEK is making its final approach to land near Lunar Cod 6. It does, however, have its engine cut out 9 seconds early, which sends us plummeting towards the surface, but thankfully not so fast that we do any serious damage. Those braking thrusters coming in clutch as they prevent us from toppling over. It is quite a large unwieldy lander, but such are the constraints of our payload fairing. We couldn't make anything wider and squatter without making a much wider and more expensive rocket. But there we have it! Landed safely in Mare Tranquillitatis, a mere 1.5 kilometers from Lunar Cod 6. We might have got a little bit closer if I had a little bit more Delta V to spare, but as you may have noticed, we overshot and had to do a boost back burn. We actually ran out of ignitions on our RD859 secondary engine and had to do the final approach with the single core 858 engine on its own. But it had just enough thrust to weight ratio for us to touch down. I was going to say gently. It would have allowed us to touch down gently if we hadn't run out of fuel somehow. I think that's something to do with Realism Overhaul's pressure residuals as to why the engine cut out early, because it wasn't a test light failure. I thought I'd timed it all perfectly, as Svetlana elaborates on with her flag plaque. But all's well that ends well. Any landing that you walk away from. Felix there conducting his deep surface sample, which only scientist Kerbals can perform, which is the reason why we brought him along. We'll be rendezvousing with Lunar Cod 6 and going on a merry little adventure in the next episode. Thank you very much for watching, everyone. I do hope you've enjoyed. Next episode has a whole bunch of very exciting things to look forward to. Krasny 3 will be arriving at Mars and its moons. We've got our military contract for 1967, which I won't spoil just yet, and possibly the first launch of the UR700 that we designed in a recent stream. During the hiatus, I've been hard at work on the modpack, and the massive 1.5 update is due to release in the next few weeks. You can follow my development on the Beardy dev branch of our newly created GitHub, link in the description below. As always, my save and craft files are on my Patreon. FAQ is back, and hopefully back to stay. Thanks for watching, Penguinauts, and I'll see you all next time. A massive thank you to my patrons for their generous support, and an extra special thank you to the Amazing Steak, Dakota Clark, Madzor, Peaches Tinnett, Simone67, Scott Milligan, Lady Lagsalot, Jesse Smith, NX74656, Olaf Hammerhand, Jordan Millwood, Luna Nicole the Fox, Frosty Moon, Mr. Blue Star, Hendrick, Con of Class, and F22 Raptor.